So we've seen how we can create sub-objects. Now in this video we want to learn about UStaticMeshComponents so that we can go and create primitive components basically that that allow for some visual representation. We can add static meshes to our actors. Now in Blueprints this is very easy. Of course you just click a drop down and then you add a static mesh. In C++ again we have to create a sub-object. So recap on using component. So scene components. An actor can designate a using component as its root component. The actor's transform is then drawn from that component, so its location, rotation, and scale. Now using component and its child classes have the ability to form trees by attaching to each other. So basically you're creating parent-child relationships, so you can attach a static mesh to another static mesh, for example, or a static mesh to a using component, and so forth. Now a scene component can have any number of children, but it can have only one parent. If you remember from the previous video, we have the uPrimitive component as well, and that is a child, or is a uScene component. Scene components that contain or generate some sort of geometry for rendering or collision purposes. So a few examples are box component and capsule component, and these generate invisible geometry for collision detection. Don't worry about this too much for right now. We'll take a look at a few examples eventually. Okay, then you have the static mesh component, which is what we'll talk about in this video. And then you also have skeletal mesh components, which we'll see later in the course. Now those contain pre-built geometry basically, okay, that is rendered and can be used for collision detection as well, if you want to do that. Okay, so before we move on, I want to clean up my actor here. So you can of course go and start with a clean actor, okay, create a new actor, but I'm going to clean this one up instead. So first I'll clean up the constructor. I'm also going to select these two lines and I'm going to comment them out because I'm going to create, in the next section, I want to create a static mesh component. So in the header file, I'll clean all of these up as well. And I'll comment these two lines out as well. And let's look at something else. We have UStaticMeshComponent. Then we want to create a pointer, my mesh, or something like that, just some mesh component. I'll actually just copy and paste that property over. So this is also a pointer here, and it has again this property, and it's visible anywhere. I would like to note that sometimes you forward declare things like this. You often see the class being forward declared up here before you have the U class as well. We'll probably talk about that in more detail later. This tends to work without there being any problems, but if you get problems, again, what you can do is you can do class UStaticMeshComponent. Doesn't really matter, we can leave it like this for now, okay? And that again is simply a forward declaration. A forward declaration like this basically means that I have not included the file for this yet, and we'll in a second here we'll include the file in the CPP file, okay? So this basically says it's not included yet, but don't worry, I will include it at some point. So Unreal Engine uses a include what you use system. Previously you could just use the stuff without having to do forward declarations and having to do a bunch of includes in your .cpp file. But you had lots of problems with very long compile time, so they've kind of streamlined the system, and so now we use what's known as include what you use. Okay, so we have this variable now. Let's go and do in the constructor again. Create default sub-object. What we want is UStaticMeshComponent. Okay, so we want the text macro to give this a name. We'll set that to the new root component, uncomment that. We'll get back to this guy right here a bit later on. And what I'd also like to do is I'd like to include this UStaticMeshComponent. What I'll do is I'll down include components / and I'll do static mesh component.h. Alright, so how do we know what it is that we need to include here? Well, there are a few ways. Firstly, you can go to the documentation. Okay, so have the documentation, you can search for static mesh component. So Unreal Engine 4 documentation, C++ API, for example, and or maybe just search in here for static mesh. And then here you can switch. So currently it's documentation. You have UDK, which is Unreal Development Kit. So, but all the you have Blueprint API, so stuff relating to blueprints. Click on that, you can see the switches. Okay. Click on C++. That's what we want. So UStaticMeshComponent is what we want. And here you can see the inheritance hierarchy. You can see up here is the USIN component. UStaticMeshComponent inherits from that. So that is a USIN component. Then you can see references in the header. You can see this is the include basically. You only have to include what is after classes. So components / static mesh component.h. You don't have to include this entire thing. So you can see components / static mesh component. What you can do is you can search for static mesh in your solution explorer. Okay, so maybe static mesh component, since we know that we want a component. You can see this is external dependencies and all that stuff. So what we are looking for is components. So we scroll down until we see engine, classes, components, and you can see static mesh component.h. You can also search .h. So again, we don't have to include everything. We can do components / and then you can see static mesh component. If you search .h, scroll down, again you have static mesh component.h. That is under classes, components, and static mesh component.h. So two ways of searching for that, again in the Solution Explorer or in the Unreal Engine documentation. Here's another example with the USpringArm component. You scroll down, you see the header, classes, game framework / springarm component. So what you'd include is game framework / springarm component.h. Okay, springarm component is something that we'll use a bit later on. It's just one example. There are many examples, and this tries to maintain its children at a fixed distance from the parent. So it's useful if you want to attach a camera to something, for example. So okay, back in Visual Studio and the Solution Explorer, let's say we want again. Now, of course, we include the .h file, so it makes sense to say .h. And here it is, springarm component.h. So what do we include? We include everything after classes. So game framework / springarm component.h. Okay, so just another quick example. We're not actually going to use this right now. Okay, so back to the components. So I have this set up, my mesh, and here we create a sub-object. Again, this will return a pointer. And we create a UStaticMesh component and we give it a name. Here again, we set the mesh, that mesh, as the root component. Let's just see what this does. Okay, so Unreal loads up here. I'll open up my very interesting actor, the blueprint class. You can see we have this top here, that is the actor itself. Now I would like to mention, if you have something else selected like the sphere and you don't quite remember how to get back to the class settings or the class defaults, okay, if you remember, you can click on that in the actor, so where it says self, so the blueprint class name basically. But you also have options in this toolbar, so you can click on class defaults, right, and that will also have that available now. Okay, so now you can see this my mesh now is the root component, and this sphere here is what we created previously. So I can actually just delete that because we don't need it anymore. Okay. We are now going to use our own mesh. And so here we can set the static mesh for this. So I can click this drop down and then I can select something like the cylinder or whatever else it is that we want. You can also apply materials if you want to do that. Okay. All of this functionality is included with the static mesh component. I'll compile and save that, and now actually I have an instance of that in the world. Can drag out a couple more instances, and we can, with one of those instances selected, you can change out the mesh if you want, and the materials and stuff as well. Okay, so another primary topic that we'll be talking about in this video is the concept of attachment. So basically we want to attach one component to another, and in that way we form a tree. So again, we create kind of parent-child relationships between those, okay, as we've seen, but again in C++ as opposed to in blueprints, because again in blueprints you can just add your components and drag and drop them where you want them basically. For the most part, we'll be using setup attachment in the constructor. As you can see here, it says useful in constructors and when dealing with components that haven't been registered. Whereas attach to component attaches one scene component to another immediately and is useful during play. Now, in order for actor components to update each frame and affect the scene, the engine must register them. This happens automatically for components created as sub-objects of an actor when that actor spawns. So again, if you create an instance of that actor in the scene, for example, that is when you spawn that actor. But you also have manual registration for components created during play. That's a bit more of an involved process that you don't have to worry about for right now. So both of these functions are valid. You also have attached to component. Previously you had attached to, and that is deprecated now, so its use is discouraged, and your code might actually not work if you use that in upcoming versions of Unreal Engine. So we have to use these new ones now. So attached to component, you also have attached to actor and various other things. But you can see this one is a bit longer. You specify what you want to attach to, and then you have this if attachment transform rules, okay, those two colons, and then keep relative transform. Now the attachment rules describe how we want to handle the transforms and like welding when we do the attachment. Now I'm going to be a bit naughty and kind of skip this function in this video. In upcoming videos, we are going to discuss transforms and vectors and such. And once we are done with that, then I'll do a quick demo of this attached to component, just so that when we actually use this at some point in the future, that you have more or less an idea of what's going on, or again, if you want to use this for your own projects. So for this video, we'll mainly focus on setup attachment. A side note here is you can also attach actors by attaching the root component of one actor to a component belonging to another actor. So you have this attached to component, you also have attached to actor. Alright, just as a side note, now we won't be looking at this anytime soon, but we probably will get back to that and do an example at some point. So this can be quite complicated, but if you stick to the basics here, again, you set up attachment in the constructor, you'll be fine, and we'll look at some of the other examples, as we go along. Okay, I'll uncomment that. I'll be using this using component again. And I'll go back into the CPP file, uncomment that line, and I'll set the root component to root. If you don't remember where this root component comes from, this is an inherited variable. So I'll right click, go to definition. You can see that will open up the actor.h file. And here we can see this property, using component, root component. The component that defines the transform, so location, rotation, and scale of this actor in the world, right? So that is where it comes from. We don't have to declare this or set this up. This is inherited, so that is why we have this. I would like to also note that you have get root component and set root component functions. So you have set root component like this, for example, and this is very similar. These two are pretty much the same. So once again, you can right click on this, go to declaration. In this case, you want to go to the actor.h file. Then again, you can look at the comments to see what this does. Set root component to be the specified component. Okay, I'll just close that off again. Now I prefer to use this, okay, instead of this. I just want to mention that you do have that available. Okay, so let's look at how we can set this up now to be in a parent-child relationship, or basically how we can attach these components. So basically what I want to do is I want to attach my mesh to whatever the root component is. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll do my mesh, Since that is a pointer, we need to use that weird operator there to get to the functions. Set up attachment, again whatever the root component is. So this will attach my mesh to whatever is the root component. And I'll build and run this. Right, so as we can see, we have the root. That is now the root component. And then we have this, you can see you have this drop down, and now you have my mesh, which is now attached to root. And so back in the .cpp file, again, my mesh is attached to root. You can also, as I mentioned, to get root component, this will return whatever is currently the root component. You don't really want to set up attachment to this root. If you want to explicitly, connect that to the root component, because this might change. Okay, we might go and do another one of these sub-objects and then specify that to be the root. And then this thing is no longer the root again if it's called root like this. Okay, so again, whatever is specified here might change as we work. So we just want to go and choose like whatever is currently set to be the root component, get that and attach this explicitly again to whatever is the root component. And as I mentioned, there are two ways you can do root component, or you can do get root component. Okay, so I don't want to spend too much more time on this. What I'd like you to try and do, so maybe for practice, what I'd like you to do is go and do another UStaticMeshComponent and then attach that to the root. And maybe what you can do then is you can do another USeeComponent, like again here, and then you can attach that to whatever the root is, and then attach two UStaticMeshComponents to that. And in that way you can go and experiment with that and see how that populates this tree here.